Today's episode is episode 176 of Unconventional Humans podcast. Today's episode is about neuroplasticity. So I'll start by just giving an explanation of neuroplasticity, a very brief explanation. What stood out in my mind is that neuroplasticity is the ability for the brain to develop new neural pathways in the brain so that you can develop new skill sets. And in my experience, you can also work with this facet of the brain to help change your personality. So I'll just talk about my experience with neuroplasticity because this was an eye-opener for me. What I would do is encourage you to look into neuroplasticity if you haven't read about it before. You don't need an in-depth knowledge of it. I just found it useful to understand that the brain can change, the brain can adapt, and also that the brain can have a huge effect on how you see the world and your current capabilities. Like some of it is common sense that if you don't practice something, you're not going to get good at something. Some of it is might not be very evident because I feel like there's the self-limiting beliefs that you can believe about yourself that will limit you from developing new neural pathways in your brain. So for example, you could be somebody who wants to write a book, who wants to become an author. I guess this was me before. But you can't imagine that happening for you. You can imagine it for people who are already established authors, how they could go about publishing another book, how they'd have I think it's a lack of confidence, a lack of self-esteem to even say that that's what you want. And then it's putting in the hard work to actually make that come about. I think the I think the biggest struggle for me for writing a book would have been the ability to commit to I'm going to write this book, I'm going to publish it. That was a very tricky part, and then obviously it's the actual hard work of actually writing the book afterwards to actually have things to put into a book. The way I negotiated that was I didn't tell anybody I was writing a book until they had to know, even close family, because I understood myself. I understood that if I understood where I was at that time, I was very much susceptible to external validation. Not that I don't think if I said it and I got, well, actually I did say it, I did get a bad reaction, or not a bad reaction, but just kind of a dismissive a reaction to it. Yeah, it wouldn't have stopped me from pursuing the path of writing a book, but I knew that if I was looking for validation from my external environment for me to write a book, then it would never happen. So I had to start from a place where it was internal validation. I guess that goes hand in hand with writing a book anyway, because if you're somebody who's inclined to want to write a book, you would have to focus a lot of your energy on the inner world and thinking through things yourself and seeing the little subtleties and nuances to your own life. So you'll be in that realm anyway, but I suppose you could live so much of your life facing outwards, looking outwards, that it's a novelty to realize that the validation can come from within. Why I found neuroplasticity a useful thing to know about in my life is because, again, it comes back to knowing myself. There's a part of me that's quite pragmatic and needs to have a certain amount of evidence to believe something. So I found with neuroplasticity, even though I didn't need an in-depth knowledge of it, I'm not a scientist or a doctor or a brain surgeon. I just needed to know enough to realize that the brain can change and it can adapt. Because that wasn't always how people viewed the brain, even in the scientific field. There was at one point, it was believed that the brain wasn't changeable, like this neuroplasticity wasn't a concept that was well known in science. So I found it useful to have some bit of evidence that showed me that on a biological level, that my brain can change, and with that could come about new skills, new knowledge, even new personality. So then when I start reading more in the self-help realm, I start sifting through that little minefield that contains a lot of golden nuggets, but a lot of bombs inside there as well. So when I was reading through that, which is a bit more intangible in certain regards, like if you start reading a bit about quantum physics and you start reading about energy and healing and different things, which I feel are real, but there's a lot to sift through. Because I've got quite a logical brain and I don't want to live in fairyland, I don't want to live my entire life in fairyland. I want to find that balance really between putting weight on the inner world, living in reality, and bringing about real change through that process, through that integration process. So for me, it's a lot of what I do is about integration, and there's so many aspects of the human being to be integrated that I found it useful to keep an open mind. But then there's certain things that I'd like to have some bit of evidence. So neuroplasticity is something that helps me with that. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see a picture in the background which comes from, I think, chapter 10. I think it's chapter 10 of my new book. It's a paragraph on the distraction economy. Just talks a little bit around the fact that the world is set up today, our world, the Western world, is set up in a way where it's optimized for distraction because our energy, our attention, and our time are valuable commodities in a capitalist world. So that's something, that sort of an environment can create a feeling of being a victim to your environment. And it's true because your environment is set up in a way where it's trying to distract you because it wants your attention at all costs, because that equals money and profit. And I'm finding with looking into things like neuroplasticity, becoming a programmer, understanding a little bit better about algorithms, understanding about how to optimize my mind better, that's helped me to live in a world which is optimized for my distraction. That's not to say that I'm not susceptible to this stuff. I do struggle quite a bit with social media as a creator. I don't know whether I go on social media so much. I wasn't posting stuff to do with the podcast and with my books. I did make a conscious decision years ago that I wanted to create more than I consumed on social media. And I feel like that has made a big difference. What I've learned to do over the years too is to just unfollow people and different things that weren't adding any value to my life, that I felt like I was actually getting triggered by, and I was probably putting bad energy towards. So I said it's better off in the long run for both of us if I just start unfollowing certain things. So with neuroplasticity and with this adaptability of the brain, I guess when I connect that to changing your personality, I'm talking more in the sense of getting more in connection with your true personality. Because I feel like when you're unconscious to this ability of the brain to create neural pathways, when you're unconscious of that, I think you identify a lot with your brain. So with neuroplasticity, I think the big thing for me was that it made my brain more objective. So it helped me to realize that what I can and can't do right now is a reflection of the neural pathways that I built in my brain. And what I can and can't do in the future is a reflection of the neural pathways that I either did or didn't spend the time developing. So it made the whole thing a bit more objective. It helped me to get a bit more space for my brain to stop identifying so much with my brain, the thoughts in my head. That might sound like an odd thing to say, maybe, but for me, what I'd gone through, I had to have a level of space between the thoughts in my head and my sense of who I am. I think as people, that's what we all have to go through. We all go through it in our own way. It's just I went through it in my own way. And this concept helped me to make the brain more objective, to realize everybody's got this brain. You either use it, consciously use it, or you don't use it. I feel when you're not using it, your brain starts to unconsciously work against you because it ties into this world we're living in, which is optimized for your attention at all costs. The capitalist world, isn't there to educate you a lot of the time. It's there to earn money. It's the bottom line. It's business. That's the hard lesson you learn when you move out of the academic world into the business world. There's a hard lesson to learn that it's the bottom line that always counts. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a bad thing when we sacrifice what we believe in, who we are, in the service of profit. But it's a good thing in that it's only really what works is what will survive. So if you're doing something that isn't working and you're trying to turn it into a business, the business world is the best way to test whether an idea will add value to people to the extent that they're willing to pay for it. I think the purest part of business, obviously the waters can get muddled here too. I think the purest positive thing to business is that it kills off the ideas that don't add value, and the ideas that do add value, the things that do add value to people, survive because people are willing to give money to that because they see the value in that. It's all about value. Of course, the waters get muddled in that, but ultimately, I think that's the main positive to living in a capitalist world. The negative, though, is that you've got an environment that can manipulate you. And saying all this, from looking at history, from looking at the world, I feel like capitalism possibly is the best of the alternatives. When you look at how communism plays out, I think it's a nice idea, but it doesn't take into account humans, people. Like, we're very complex. There's a lot of dark sides to human nature, and also, I guess you're trying to impose a system on people. I suppose you're trying to impose a system either way, but it's just good to be aware of that. We're just going back to my original point about the brain becoming more objective. What I found is that it helped me to not identify so much with my skill sets, because up until the point that I started learning about neuroplasticity of the brain, I used to feel like if I'm good at something, that's just my personality. That's an intrinsic part of who I am. I think there is a certain amount of things that come natural to you. I think there is a mixture between skill and natural ability, but I don't think you can reach a very high level without an element of skill, which will be tied to these neural pathways that you're developing in your brain. And then also these neural pathways, a way that I've thought about how to optimize these is to learn from people who know what they're talking about. I found that tricky, but that's the ultimate goal. That's the deliberate practice element. That if you're just practicing the same thing over and over again, but you're not actually changing, refining, making little adjustments, then that's very limited. But if you are deliberately practicing, which is a hard thing, I found in theory, that sounds great, deliberate practice, but it's a hard thing to actually implement because you don't always know who knows what they're talking about. You can look at their experience and stuff, but sometimes also they mightn't be able to communicate their knowledge that well to you, or you might misinterpret what they're saying to you. So it's quite a tricky process. I'll do maybe an episode on deliberate practice. Even consciously trying to decide what am I going to change here that will make a difference. I found that difficult with the podcast and with my books. What I found is that I think it's creating a space. I'll just talk from deliberate practice from the point of view of a creative person who's creating something. I found put your time, energy, and attention into the space and think about the intentions, the ultimate goals that you want from this space, and allow the space to evolve over time. That's what I found I don't know, I only have my own experience, but that's what I found has made the process a bit more enjoyable in the moment, day to day. Because when I thought about the deliberate practice before that, I felt more like a certain pressure on me, and it also wasn't very tangible. Like I didn't really know what will make the difference here, and I didn't know who to ask. And I don't think you can ask one person either, because I think that's where you start falling into the realm of this hole in personal development where people who've achieved a certain amount of success try and sell you a blueprint of that success. And they don't take into account, well, they can take into account, because they're trying to sell to a lot of people, can take into account luck, context, work ethic. There's all these variables that actually go into the success that aren't taken into account. But I've often struggled with that, especially with when I've been looking into social media strategies. I don't even spend a lot of time on them, because maybe I sense at some level that this is a waste of time, because I only think it's on the really tangible skills like programming or learning a foreign language, where anybody can reach a certain like level. Even then, it's still quite intangible, but there's certain core things, like in programming, there's concepts you learn to get better. So for example, if you're a beginner, you're starting off, you're doing for loops, you learn after a while that in Python, if you're learning Python, there's list comprehensions which do the job better, and it's just one line of code instead of 3 or 4 lines of code. So you can see objectively your skill level is improving as you learn new concepts, and there's a certain standard that you're meeting after a while, because I guess it's a reflection of the jobs you can do. So you can actually measure that. But I found with social media, and I'm talking about social media because I noticed a lot of that in personal development, because you'll meet people who want to become coaches, and then the conversation goes to how do you find your client, and that's when you start thinking about social media and different things like that. I found that a minefield to think about, because you're also dealing with people who can be unethical. I've met people who didn't give a damn about GDPR. They're like, we can get away with it for the next year, so we're going to do this. We're going to do this strategy on LinkedIn, even though it might piss off some people. So you can't quantify that so easily. Somebody's ethics, their morals, their character traits, and what sits well with you. A lot of it's understanding what sits well with me here, and I think you feel that out on a more feeling level. So I guess how this ties to neuroplasticity is that once the brain became a bit more objective to me, that these are skill sets I can develop, I started paying more attention. Okay, well, who am I then? How else would I know who I am and attune with myself? So I started paying more attention to feelings, emotions, connection. They're the types of things I started paying more and more attention to as the brain became more objective to me. That this is a tool I'm using rather than something that is actually me. That's that's quite a deep realization that I think you can spend your whole life unraveling, because the brain is complex. But I found that this concept, anyway, has helped me to give me evidence that change is possible, and it's also given me space to create something that I don't know exactly how things are going to turn out, but I am open to enjoying the process, open to doing things in my own way. And I guess to also realize that there's a lot of thoughts and a lot of conditioning that was in my brain that is in other people's brains. So there's a lot of generic shit in my brain that's in other people's brains. And so the process becomes more about becoming an individual by getting out of your head, feeling into your heart and your mind, and being in your body more, using your brain as a tool. That's an exploration and a fun process in itself, to realize that you could have really shitty beliefs about yourself that you picked up in your environment, and you might never have been aware that other people are living with similar beliefs until you start verbalizing it and creating something individual to you. And then I think at some level that helps other people to start discovering things for themselves and self-actualize. I think it's a self-actualization process. So I think the fun thing with neuroplasticity is that you just don't know where you're going to end up. You don't know the type of person you're going to become. You don't know the knowledge you're going to have, the skill sets you're going to develop. Like one thing I've noticed in me right now is that taking an interest in poetry I suppose Matt Burke was on the podcast. I enjoyed reading his poems. I think that was the start of the year. There's another YouTuber on, well, she's not really a YouTuber. I came across her. I'll put a link in the show notes. Savannah Brown. I like how she thinks about the world. She seems very in tune, in touch with herself. And I like the way she talks. It's like it's giving an experience of somebody who is putting voice to just the thoughts inside her head. And I found it very relatable. So I recently purchased her book on poetry and her new novel. Again, that's another thing I'm getting into more is the fiction realm. I'm enjoying reading stories like that now. And the poetry, so I started reading it. Graffiti is the name of the book. Read just a poem before I came on here. And that's something that my former self would have never been open to, doing that for pleasure, because I wouldn't really have had the life experience or knowledge to see why it would be beneficial to read the poetry there. And I think it also ties into the reason I bought that book is I watched some of her YouTube videos over the years, and I felt a certain level of authenticity there and a certain level of an understanding of the world that I don't have access to, that I'd like to know a bit more about. That's what I'd be attuning to then. And because I've worked through this stuff of, I think before I would have seen myself as somebody who wouldn't read poetry. Again, that's like a limiting belief around yourself. Like the thing is, limiting beliefs again are tricky because it's only a limiting belief if it's something you want to genuinely experience and explore, but you're stopping yourself from doing it because you have some belief about yourself that I can't put myself in that realm. And that can be like if you want to genuinely become a good dancer, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. You don't need to be a world-class dancer. You can no matter how bad you are, you can get better at it if it's a genuine desire. So I feel like limiting beliefs are only limiting beliefs when it's something you've got a genuine desire to explore. And I have a genuine desire to explore more fiction, a bit more poetry now as well, if it comes up, that I'm not going to limit myself from now because I don't have that belief about myself that I'm not somebody I'm not somebody who reads poetry, double negative there, not somebody who reads poetry or fiction. But that's what this world opens up to you then when you start looking at these concepts, these things that are more in line with reality than walking around as a fixed personality, fixed abilities, fixed potentials, and a fixed pathway. This whole thing opens up the unknown a bit more, and I honestly think it just makes your life more enjoyable. It gives you more of a reason to live in the moment and to be open to the idea that your life can change dramatically in a period of 5 years. I think the other thing I think I read about was, I think it's every 5 years or maybe even less than that, your whole body regenerates itself. So you don't even have the same body you had 5 years ago. When you start looking into this stuff, I found it really helped because these are tangible biological things that are happening. You might I don't have a full comprehension of this. I just need a slight awareness of this. I just need a little bit of an awareness around this, because then it opens my mind to a better understanding of reality. Because otherwise you can go through your whole life thinking you're the same person you were in your 20s. You could be in your 80s still thinking that and maybe it's a good thing. I don't know. Personally, I'm kind of happy now that I've been exploring this stuff over the years. I don't feel as fixated on this is who I am and that type of thing. But I think you can lead your whole life like that, where you feel like there's a solid sense of identity there that could limit you in a lot of ways. And you never really took time to question whether that was actually a tangible thing that was limiting you or not. So this is just what this thing opens up for you. If you feel like you are limiting yourself and you can't really describe how you're doing it, or why you're doing it, then I found over the years reading into this and then reading into other stuff in more the personal development realm has helped me to change things in myself that now feel actually a bit more aligned with who I actually am than the person who years back I thought I should be. So it's an unraveling process, an undoing process. It's not about becoming somebody. So you'll hear that a lot in personal development about being the best version of yourself and becoming the best version of yourself. The more I've moved along, the more I've realized it's really undoing all the conditioning being patient with that, it takes a long-term view on things. But from my process, what I pay attention to is how light I feel, how unburdened my mind feels. And the other thing would be how much more comfortable I've become in feeling different emotions. I know when I bottled up, like I'm still bottling up emotions, but I'm working through it. When I was at my height of bottling up emotions, like anger used to feel really, really bad to me, or anxiety would feel really bad to me. Now, when I feel those feelings, they don't feel as bad. They don't feel great, to be honest, but they don't feel as bad because there's not this level of trying to bottle them within me and contain them. Now I've grown to actually feel that feeling more, not give in to my. I've just noticed over time that I don't unconsciously try and bottle it up, because that is what I was doing. I was holding my body in a certain way to bottle up that emotion, and then my coping mechanism was often just bottle it up and not even express it. I think other people can just lash out. That's their coping mechanism. That's how they deal with feelings of anger and anxiety and stuff. So anyway, for me, that being the best, focusing on being the best version of yourself, that was a red herring for me, in that I now believe it's more about waking up, unraveling the social conditioning, and becoming yourself, being your authentic self. And your authentic self can look a lot of different ways. There's no, like, I don't see like a best version of that. There's just you living your life and feeling what's going on for you, experiencing what's coming up, that I think is more aligned to where I want to move. That's my direction here. So anyway, that was neuroplasticity. I hope that's added some value. Look into it. I'm not a scientist, so look into neuroplasticity and see where it goes. Yeah, as always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can head on over to unconventionalhumans.com. You can become a member of the podcast, a patron of the podcast. Or I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave maybe a rating and a review of the podcast. It helps the podcast to grow. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of these videos. Thanks again for listening, and I will speak to you on the next episode.